My name is Laura Risk, and I'm an assistant professor of music and culture at the University of Toronto Scarborough. I'd like to extend my thanks to the Center for Ethics for hosting this series, and also many thanks to Laura Menard. I'll be speaking about two pieces of music, a song called Ginger Boogie and an instrumental piece called Strange Blues. And these both feature the same musician, Ginger Smock. She was one of the first women, first African-American women to record hot jazz improvisations on the violin. She was also one of the first African-American women band leaders on television. Now, considering these two pieces of music side by side requires us to think about what I would call the ethics of historiography. How do we tell the story? How do we write the history of a musician whose recorded output includes a piece such as Strange Blues, which was Smock's own composition and which opens with her stunning virtuosic violin solo, and also a song such as Ginger Boogie, in which there's a spoken dialogue between Smock and a male bandmate in which he essentially cajoles her into having unwanted sex. So first, an introduction to Ginger Smock. She was born in Chicago in 1920, but grew up in Los Angeles in the vibrant African-American community around Central Avenue in South Central LA. She lived and worked in Los Angeles until the early 1970s when she moved to Las Vegas. And there she played in hotel showroom orchestras. And she passed away in 1995. Now, we often associate jazz with the Eastern United States, New Orleans, Chicago, New York, Kansas City, but Los Angeles was also a hotbed. Just a few examples: Jelly Roll Morton played on Central Avenue in 1917. Kid Ory recorded the groundbreaking Creole trombone in Los Angeles in 1921. Louis Armstrong moved to town in 1930 to jumpstart his film career. Growing up, Ginger Smock studied classical violin privately under Bessie Downs. She was something of a child prodigy, performing at the Hollywood Bowl to a standing ovation at age 10. At Jefferson High School, Ginger Smock joined the orchestra and the marching band. She was the drum majorette and studied there under celebrated educator Sam Brown. Smock played with two youth ensembles, the All-City Symphony and the Junior Philharmonic, and went on to study at the Zollner Conservatory of Music. This early history and training is important in that when we look at Smock's early life, we see all the hallmarks of a pre-professional classical music career. In the early 1940s, however, African Americans were excluded from professional orchestras in the United States. Ginger Smock had also learned to play jazz as a child, but not through formal lessons. She was a fan of big bands, and in her words, she liked to sit by the phonograph and improvise to Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Jimmy Lunsford. She studied the recordings of jazz violinists such as Joe Venuti, Stuff Smith, and Eddie South. She listened to Stéphane Grappelli and the Hot Club of France on the radio. In 1943, she was called to substitute for Stuff Smith, jazz violinist Stuff Smith, at a local club. And she later told Downbeat magazine, "That's when I decided that if I couldn't be a Heifetz, I'd settle for being a good jazz violinist." That same year, she launched two all-woman bands, the Sepia Tones and the 3 Vs, later the 4 Vs. This is World War II, and women were claiming space in the male-dominated music industry, as Sherry Tucker has documented. However, as Tucker has also noted, promoters and audiences expected women instrumentalists to perform a more varied and less challenging repertoire. The Sepia Tones, for instance, played pieces like Rhapsody in Blue and Holiday for Strings. Ginger Smock's star continued to rise through the 1940s. She had another band called Ginger and Her Magic Notes. They played the opulent Coconut Grove in Santa Monica. She also held down long stints at the Waikiki Inn, where she and her band dressed, as she said, Hawaiian, including grass skirts. And as the Cleveland Call-in Post has noted, she, and I quote, scored a smash success as the first lady of the violin at another club, The Last Word. And clubs in San Francisco began bidding against each other for her services. Also in the mid-40s, she recorded on the Girls in Jazz album produced by Leonard Feather and hosted a radio show, Melody Parade. So she's developing a diverse freelance career as a professional musician. In 1951, she made the leap to television as a band leader for a very short-lived CBS production, The Chicks and the Fiddle. And according to Downbeat, the all-woman band on the show, on The Chicks and the Fiddle, were the first, and I quote, sepia swingsters to break into West Coast TV. And that fall, she was also tapped for local variety show, Dixie Showboat. She was later an occasional guest on Spade Cooley's Hoffman Hayride. So it's about this point in her career, in the early 1950s, that Smock records her composition, Strange Blues, recorded in 1953. So let's listen. I'd like you to listen for some of the hallmarks of her playing here, the horn-like phrase structures, her virtuosic use of left-hand pizzicato, trills, glissandi, the conspicuous slides, the wide vibrato. Here we go, Strange Blues. And my second recording, Ginger Boogie, is from around the same time. So as I mentioned, in 1953, Smock toured the West Coast with the Jackson Brothers Orchestra. And in this song, we hear a spoken duet between her and one of the male band members.
I love to do the boogie with Ginger, 'cause Ginger puts it on my mind. I love to do the boogie with Ginger, 'cause she's so doggone fine. When Ginger starts to roll, she'll wig you every time. Ginger, 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 baby, won't you hear me call? Ginger, 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 wanna park right in your stall. Ginger, 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 I'm in love and that ain't all. Hey, there's Ginger now. Hi, Ginger.
Hello, Claude.
Say, that's a fine box you got there,
You mean my violin?
Yes, let's make it, baby, one time.
I should say not.
Pretty please.
No.
Please.
Well, maybe. All right.
Well, rock me, baby, rock me with all your might.
In an article on pianist Hazel Scott, Monica Hairston has suggested that, and I quote, by shifting the frame to include gender as a category of analysis, we see her, Hazel Scott, perform an integrated and autonomous Black female subjectivity that asserts female sexuality and desire as coterminous with jazz authenticity. By all accounts, Ginger Smock was a stunning performer. The Pittsburgh Courier called her a, and I quote, heartthrob violinist entertainer who runs the gamut from Bach to boogie. One way to read her performance on Ginger Boogie is that she seems to have had a pragmatic understanding of the fact that as a young woman, both her artistry and her body were on display, and she willingly played that part. Ginger Smock's career continued for another 30-some years after these recordings. From 1953 to 55, she toured nationally with the R&B group Steve Gibson and the Redcaps. Returning to Los Angeles, she played local clubs, worked as an MC and band leader for the television show Rhythm Review, and in the early 60s, she became the first woman musical director for the SS Catalina, which was a summertime cruise ship. She released her only full-length album with that band, and this was an LP of what she called island music, entitled On the SS Catalina with the Shipmates and Ginger. And as I mentioned, she spent her last decades in Las Vegas performing in hotel orchestras, the Sands, the Flamingo, Caesar's Palace, and the Tropicana, where she was the concertmaster. So to return to my initial question about the ethics of historiography, I've been thinking about how to write Ginger Smock's story since I first encountered her music about a decade ago. What story do we tell about her if Strange Blues is the soundtrack? What story do we tell if Ginger Boogie is the soundtrack? How do we tell a story that includes both? And what story do we tell if we also include all of the recordings that Ginger Smock didn't make? And this points to another moment from her career, also in 1953. This is a story that she told on several occasions when a talent scout for the record label RCA Victor heard her playing jazz violin in San Francisco at a club. He made a demo recording of her and he brought it back to the executives at his label to try to get a recording contract for her. And here I quote this story as Ginger Smock told it to Sherry Tucker. Smock said, he told the executives, sit down, I want you to hear something. So when he finished playing the two numbers, these guys were so impressed. And they said, who on earth is playing the violin? We've never heard anything like this. And he says, a colored girl up there in San Francisco. And they said, oh, forget it. We've got Joe Venuti. Thinking about Ginger Smock's story brings us to the challenges that Sherry Tucker has put to us in her 1996 article on West Coast women, in which Ginger Smock tells that story. As Sherry Tucker writes, the question is not only what did women do, which has been omitted from historical memory, and how might we add it back in, but also what struggles have taken place, which have resulted in the disqualification of women's knowledge. Thank you.